Hey everybody, here we go. Another conversation about anatomy, this time focusing on the skeleton. You see here the goals of this video. Talk a little bit about themes of the skeletal system, which might seem like an odd place to start. We'll talk about bone, the ingredients, functions of the skeleton, and even some basic bone classification. What do we mean by themes? There are some major ideas I need you to keep in mind as we explore the skeletal system, including bone histology and the way bone tissue is going to be working on the most basic level. So let's start with this idea. Bone is dynamic. The expression dry as a bone, whoever thought that up should be shot. Bone is very, very dynamic tissue. You see even in this chart showing you all these arrows indicating processes. Bone is constantly changing and evolving and growing and shrinking, and it's a source of minerals, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But bone is a dynamic tissue. Please do not be led to believe by anybody that we have these sticks in our body and that all they do is support us. In fact, bone tissue is very, very dynamic. Whenever we talk about the skeletal system, we tend to focus on the bony part of the skeletal system, understandably, but also keep in mind that the skeletal system depends heavily upon cartilage. Cartilage has some extremely important roles in making sure the skeletal system works the way it's supposed to work. You see down at the bottom the three types. You should recognize these from our discussion of basic connective tissue: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Let's just briefly highlight them here. The blue represents hyaline cartilage, and if you remember hyaline cartilage at all from lab, it's that kind of blue glossy tissue. Hyaline cartilage is basically some collagen fibers in water. It is a very slick, flexible tissue, not really strong, but it gives some absorbency and some buoyancy and a little bit of extra flexibility to certain parts of the skeletal system. We see hyaline cartilage, for example, associated with the nose. We see it here showing you at the joints. We see it in the lungs. We see, again, down here in the joints, a little hard to see down here. But hyaline cartilage has a number of important roles, but mainly hyaline cartilage serves to give us, again, a little bit of flexibility, or give you a smooth surface by which bones can join other bones. You see hyaline cartilage here associated with the trachea as well. So hyaline cartilage is one type, and again, when you think of hyaline cartilage, you're thinking of a little bit of a bouncy tissue, but still gives you some structural support. Elastic tissue, which you see here in green, is only shown in a couple of places. You see it represented here, the cartilage of your outer ear, and way over here, you see it in the epiglottis. The epiglottis helps direct traffic in your throat. It makes sure that when we swallow food, it doesn't go into our trachea, it goes into our esophagus. Elastic cartilage is a bendy cartilage with a little more structural support, but you don't see it in a lot of places. The last type you see represented here is the red fibrocartilage, and you only see it right here, and you see it some in the knee, and a little hard to see, but you also see it between the vertebrae. Fibrocartilage is a tougher cartilage. It's got more fibers in it, thus the name. So that's going to give you more structural support. So once again, you can see how anatomy reflects physiology, and we see different types of cartilage in different places supporting the skeleton in different ways. Oh, forgot I had these. There we go. Okay, and one other major theme is the bone, skeleton in particular here, has multiple functions. We tend to focus on the support and movement, and understandably so. That's a major function of the skeleton. The skeleton also serves a major protection role. Think about your brain being protected by the skull, or your thoracic organs being protected by the ribs, or your pelvic organs being protected by the pelvis. So clearly this hard shell of the bone gives you some protection, but there's some other functions that are maybe not as obvious to most people. One is the role in storage. The skeleton is a major storage site in particular for minerals. These two, calcium and phosphate, as you'll see in a second, are principally stored in the skeleton, but there's also growth factors that we store in the bone that basically are metabolic additive factors, and we'll talk about those more in class, and even triglycerides. Triglycerides you should recognize as fats, and yes, some of our bone does store fat. So that's a major function that maybe people don't normally associate with the skeleton. Another function is the production of hormones, including this one, osteocalcin. Osteocalcin is going to be really important as a metabolic hormone. It influences things as in some kinds of metabolism, as sugar metabolism. We see some folks who have issues with this, with some diabetic issues. So again, you don't think about bones being hormone-producing parts, but in fact they are. And a major role we associate with the skeletal system is hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is the production of blood cells. Blood cells are not mitotic. They don't, from red blood cells, you don't produce more red blood cells. Red and white and platelets are produced in the bone marrow, so that's within the bones themselves. So again, functions you may not normally associate with a skeleton, but are important for me to remind you of here before we get too far into our conversation of skeletal physiology. Before we get into the cells and get into things like osteoporosis and bone diseases, let's make sure we take just a second and remind ourselves of things, a very basic question: what's bone? We can think of bone sort of in two different lights or two different perspectives. Bone is tissue. We saw that in our histology conversation. Bone is connective tissue. And because of that, we're supposed to find organic and inorganic parts. You remember the conversation about connective tissue was we're going to have cells in a matrix, and there's going to be some fibers and some other things around that. So bone is a tissue. It is a major ingredient of bone, of the bone, but it's not. Let me back up. Bone is a kind of tissue. It also makes up what we think of as a humerus, or we think of as a tibia, which is the other case down here. We can think of, when we say the term bone, we can think of a structure. Technically, your humerus or your radius or your ulna are organs, because they're going to consist of more than just bone tissue. They're also going to have vascular tissue, and they're going to have nervous tissue. So I just give you this to make you think about bone kind of in two different perspectives. Bone, the tissue, and bone, the organ, or the bone, the structure. So what is it when we talk about a bone? What's it made of? As we mentioned just previously, bone has organic and inorganic components to it. So the organic parts include things that we associate with life, of course. So cells, proteins, which are made by cells, in particular the protein collagen. So this is the organic part of bone, but there's also the inorganic part of bone, and the term we use for all of this is called hydroxyapatite. This means all the minerals, all the other non-organic ingredients that make up bone give us this entire structure. But a real important question to ask is, why do you have to have both? I mean, do you need to have organic pieces and inorganic pieces to make up a bone? You can see the role of each if you remove each. So this slide here, or this part of the slide here, is showing you what happens if you remove the minerals. If I took a bone, a raw bone, and I put it in vinegar, vinegar is going to leach out all of the minerals and all the inorganic parts and pull them out, and what I'll be left with is a bone that I can bend and twist like a pretzel. So it might give you a little hint as to what the inorganic part does. We'll get there in a second. If I were to take this, another raw bone, and I were to remove the organic part, and I do this by cooking it. If I heat up bone, it breaks down the cells, it breaks down the proteins, and then I'm left with nothing. And then I end up with this, end up with a bone that will shatter. So now we can go back and look at the two main roles here. What do inorganic components do? Inorganic parts give the bone hardness. They make sure the bone is going to be hard. So if I remove those, bone gets soft. So inorganic makes the bone hard. What does the organic part does? Organic part do. The organic part does do, not sure. The organic part, what it's going to be responsible for is giving the bone some bendability or some flexibility. If there's no organic part in there, there's no collagen, then the bone gets very brittle and it shatters. You can hit on something and it'll shatter like you see here. So the organic part gives the bone flexibility. The inorganic part gives the bone hardness. And you've got to have both. And we'll talk about some diseases like a disease called brittle bone disease, and you can actually figure out what the issue is based upon what the bone does. This just shows you that the composition of bone. I think it's important to note this, that the organic part of the bone is only about 1/3 of the bone. The rest of the bone is inorganic. Everything else you see here is showing you the inorganic or the hydroxyapatite part of the bone. And quite importantly, notice this: 99% of the body's calcium, of 99% of the body's phosphate is stored in bone. Hugely important when we get into certain diseases to remember that we have this amount of storage of phosphate and calcium in the bone, and you'll see the repercussions of that very soon. I'm not asking you to memorize the percentages, but be very aware of the components that you find in bone. Finally, let's end with some classification. Let me get out of the way here. And some of this is going to be more of a lab conversation. I'll just mention it here in this lecture part so that you are aware as we move into our conversations deeper in our survey in class of the skeletal system. Some classification is based on location. So stuff that you've probably already seen in lab, we can look at the axial or appendicular classification of bone. Axial means the body's main axis. It includes the skull, the vertebrae, the ribs. That's those, and maybe you saw this in lab, these 80 bones are the axial part of the skeleton, the main body axis. The appendicular part makes up the other 126. You know from your word list that append means to hang on. So an appendage are these parts that are hanging on to the axial skeleton. So what you see here in pink, as you've probably done in lab, and it confuses some people sometimes, things like the pelvic bones or the scapula and the clavicle, which seem like they're kind of attached to the axial skeleton, should be considered axial. We consider them appendicular because they are an extension of the appendage. That's how the appendage attaches to the axial skeleton. So hip bones, for example, scapula, clavicle, those are still considered appendicular. Another way of looking at bone is to look at it in terms of its gross anatomy. And we'll do this more in class when we talk about spongy versus compact. We can look at the organization of the tissues, and when you're holding a bone, for example, in your hand, and you feel the hardness of that, you're feeling the compact part of the bone. Within the bone, though, there could be spongy bone where you have your marrow. We'll talk about that more in class. The shape of the bone is another way of classifying bone. As you've probably already done in lab, a bone, excuse me, sorry about that, a bone that is longer, a bone that is longer than it is wide is considered to be a long bone. Hang on one second. Okay, I'll try again. So long bones, and again, some bones are obviously long, like a femur or a humerus, but even your phalanges, your bones of your fingers, are considered long bones because they are longer than they are wide. Short bones are considered to be squarish bones. They are about the same width and length as the width and length are very similar, so we consider short bones to be in that category. Flat bones, the name's fairly descriptive, like we see in the sternum, like we see in bones of the skull. These are going to be bones that have a little bit different anatomy internally. So it's not just the fact that they appear to be flat, but they have this arrangement of compact and spongy and compact tissue that we'll talk about in class. And then bones that really are not any of these other ones. Irregular bones include the vertebrae. They're not organized as long or as flat or as short. They have strange, if you will, shapes. So we consider them their own category of irregular bones. And there are some other examples that we will talk about in class. And finally, bone markings. Just as you get further in your discussion of the skeletal system, please don't think about these bones in your arms and your legs and around the body as just sticks. They're going to have unusual areas that are kind of rough, or they're going to have these areas that are round, or they're going to have these indentations. And you'll see words like fossa and ridge and trochanter, and some of these terms, you see they're an epicondyle. You'll see some of these terms that are a little unusual. Most of the time, these weird parts of the bone are going to be where muscles attach or blood vessels pass through, or where bones articulate. But I just wanted you to want to remind you that bones are not simply sticks. They're going to have unusual features or markings. They're going to be very important for their other physiological needs, as in attachment sites for muscles. That does it for this video. We will do some more stuff with bones in class. Thanks.